Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Editors Circle event of Canada's National History Society. My name is Bruce McClellan. I'm the current board chair of the Society, and it's a pleasure to briefly welcome everyone here tonight before I turn it over to our host and moderator for the discussion, Mark. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are located and meeting on traditional territories of Indigenous peoples who have called these lands their home before the arrival of settlers, and who have lived here for thousands of years stewarding the land and continue to do so. At Canada's History Society, we seek to reflect this history by telling Indigenous stories so that the narrative of our history is inclusive, honest, and complete. I also want to shout out to a few folks who who had registered and are joining us tonight in the audience. We have the pleasure of, I think, 3 former chairs of the board with us tonight: Charlotte Gray, Joe Martin, and Dick Pound. So welcome, thank you for being here tonight. In addition to myself, we have some other of the board members here tonight. Bill Caulfield Brown from Tobermory, Ontario. Michelle Leduc from Montreal is attending, and Tim Cook from Ottawa is attending. And Tim is not only a board member, but a noted historian. And if anybody's looking for more reading or for gift ideas, Tim's newest book is Lifesavers and Body Snatchers, a look at World War I battlefield medicine from his Canadian perspective. We also have some great supporters of the organization that were joining us tonight. Dorothy Hollingsworth, I think, is here. Tanis Richardson from Winnipeg is here. I know we're expecting Greg Wong as well. So thanks to everybody. Canada's History Society is a national charitable organization, and we depend on our supporters to allow us to do what we do to build a stronger Canada, a stronger democracy in Canada, by a better understanding of the history of these lands. We provide digital and print platforms for all Canadians to engage with the story of Canada from First Peoples to the present. Last month, it was particularly exciting to be in Quebec City, where we collaborated with Governor General Mary Simon for the presentation of the Governor General's History Awards. And we had a double cohort this year due to the pandemic, with recipients from both 2021 and 2022. Her Excellency showed a particular passion for history and commitment to supporting what we do by hosting a couple of hour-long conversation with the award recipients on how to strengthen the telling of history in Canada, how to make it more inclusive. And she clearly brings a real personal interest and keen passion to support history, which is wonderful to see for everyone. We are currently working on a new 5-year strategic plan in our society, and you'll be hearing more about that in the new year. We aim to be Canada's largest history classroom, and we aim to be the best friend of Canada's history educators. We know from research and we know from interaction that they need our support. They are starved for resources. They are lacking current contemporary resources, and there's an urgent gap that we are helping to fill, but we need to do more. Tonight, we're talking about Queen Elizabeth II, who was a fixture in our lives, and for some of us, for all of our lives, and what her passing means for the monarchy in Canada. For 70 years, Queen Elizabeth managed, and has been said by that all constitutional monarchs must manage, to represent the dignified aspect of governing amidst all of the silliness and bickering and internal feuding that can happen in politics and government. And as a plus, she spoke both of our official languages. She's known for her endurance, her realism, her service, her duty, so many things that describe Queen Elizabeth. I think personally, I'm not a historian, I'm merely a supporter of historians. But personally, I find that in this highly uncertain and polarized world where people are being driven mad in their political views by social media and other forces, that the institution of the monarchy is a welcome source of stability in a world where we need more of that. So Thank you again for all of your support, for joining us tonight. And it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Mark Reid, our editor-in-chief of Canada's History magazine, and he will introduce our guest speakers and moderate a discussion. Thank you, Mark.
Bonjour et bienvenue. Je m'appelle Mark Reid, le rédacteur en chef de Histoire Canada, et c'est mon grand plaisir de parler avec vous ce soir sur une conversation de la vie et l'héritage de la reine Elizabeth, et aussi l'avenir de monarchy au Canada. Welcome, everybody. Hi. I normally would say I'm very pleased to speak with you tonight, but of course, the occasion that we're gathering it is a bit of a sad occasion. It's the passing of the Queen of Canada. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty about the future of the monarchy. And so as a former journalist, I think that there's a lot of moments where you kind of look back and say, I was there, or where was I when such and such happened? And then I think back to when I learned of the Queen's passing. I was in Nova Scotia visiting my parents, and I read it on Twitter, and I immediately ran and told my parents, and they were shocked. They couldn't believe it. And you look at these moments and you think to yourself, how can it seem like such a tragedy that a woman who's lived such a long, full life would naturally pass away? But I think the Queen was someone that we felt would live forever, possibly because she, for myself anyway, someone born in the 70s, she's just always been there. And the crown was just such an intrinsic part of Canada. It's on our money. It's in the way we talk about our laws and our governance and our crown land. Every aspect of life somehow is tied up in the crown, and yet I think a lot of people out there, there's a big misunderstanding about what is the crown and what is its role in Canada, and what would it mean to not have the crown in Canada anymore. And so tonight we're really going to be talking about two different aspects of the story. We're going to talk about the Queen as a person, her legacy, the challenges she faced and how she faced them. And we're also going to talk about the crown, which is at the heart of our laws, our government, and our treaties with First Nations. And we're going to be speaking tonight and hearing from two very, very well-respected historians who are experts in their field and highly sought after for conversations. And so one of our historian guests tonight is Carolyn Harris. Carolyn is a historian and author and a royal commentator based in Toronto. She also teaches at the University of Toronto School of Continuing Studies. And she is basically now the go-to person for analysis and thoughtful comment on all matters royalty. She's written several books about royalty, including a book on 1,000 years of royal parenting. And she is highly sought after and speaks both nationally and internationally on all forms of media about this subject. And our second guest doesn't really need an introduction to Friends of Canada's History. Christopher Moore has been with Canada's History for more than 2 decades. He is a longtime columnist for the Beaver and Canada's History, and today acts as a contributing editor. He's also a multiple award-winning author and historian who's written books that have won 2 Governor General's awards for his writing. He's able to write for kids. He's able to write for adults and academics. He's also considered an expert on Confederation and the Constitution. And so I'm really, really thrilled and pleased to have both of them with us tonight. And just a little bit about the format of our discussion. So we're going to be starting off talking with Carolyn a little bit about the life and legacy of Queen Elizabeth. And then we're going to be bringing Christopher Moore into the conversation to talk a little bit about the crown in Canada. And then we'll bring both of our guests in for a bit of a discussion at the end to talk a little bit about the future of the crown. And of course, one of the greatest gifts that they give us is their writing. And so I'm sure many of you have read, but the latest issue of Canada's History features articles by both Chris and Carolyn on the Queen in the title Canada's Queen. So starting off, welcome, Carolyn. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm really, really happy that you're able to take part in tonight's discussion.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Now, I guess the first thing I would like to ask you is this, and it's to me, it's the basic journalistic question, which is, what went through your mind when you heard that the Queen passed?
Well, I had been commentating with the media about the Queen's health. Members of the royal family were gathering at Balmoral. So I was on the CTV news channel, and we were talking about what might happen, health issues the Queen's had in the past, when on the screen, suddenly the flag was lowered and I stopped talking. Like, I was simply speechless, as the Queen was 96 years of age, but Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, had lived to be 101. So it was certainly possible for the Queen's reign to have continued for another few years. She was the longest reigning monarch in British history, but here in Canada, we have King Louis XIV of France, who reigned for 72 years. So I had been hoping Queen Elizabeth II might exceed that record as well. So there's this profound feeling of it being the end of an era. And like many people discussing the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, you think about the changes over the past 7 decades, as the end of a long reign is not only an opportunity to take stock of the individual monarch's legacy, but to look at social change, how far the United Kingdom, Canada, the rest of the Commonwealth has come in 70 years. And certainly there was a similar approach in 1901, the passing of Queen Victoria, especially with the dawning of the 20th century. This felt like the end of an era, and there were many prominent Canadians back in 1901 who commented on that. John Diefenbaker remembered his father being in tears when Queen Victoria passed away. Lucy Maud Montgomery wrote later about how when she was a child, it seemed like everyone had an image of Queen Victoria in their homes, even if it was just cut out of a newspaper, that there was that image there. And so she was struck by, when she was older, reading these more critical biographies of Queen Victoria. She'd been held in such reverence. So although 2022 is a very different time than 1901, I think there is that same sense of taking stock of an era as well as of an individual.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, in your article for in the latest issue, you know, I think that a lot of us, when we look at, we talk about our impressions of the Queen, so much of our impressions are at a distance, but then we would also get a chance to see her and other members of the royal family up close. It's almost like when the cousins are coming to town and everyone gets excited, and then they go back to wherever they're from, and you get back to your daily lives. And so the idea of these royal tours, the way that a lot of Canadians got to know the royal family, they really started with King George and Queen Elizabeth in 1939 on the eve of the Second World War. And of course, in 1951, Elizabeth visits as a princess, and then she comes back in 1953, and that's the beginning of many visits. But can you take us back a little bit? What was it like when the young Queen or young Princess Elizabeth arrived in Canada for the first time? How did Canadians react to her presence?
Well, I should provide some context in that ever since Confederation in 1867, a royal tour has often been an opportunity to assert a Canadian identity, even before the Statute of Westminster, when Canada didn't have control over its own foreign policy. Anytime there was a royal tour, there was discussion and debate regarding how Canada was presenting itself to the royal visitors and to all the press who always accompanied a royal tour. So it's interesting to see, as early as 1878, when Queen Victoria's daughter, Princess Louise, traveled to Ottawa as vice-regal consort. Her husband, Lord Lorne, was the 4th Governor General after Confederation, that the press laid out that Canadians were loyal to the crown. That made them distinct from the United States. And it's interesting to see that that continues to be a reason for supporting the monarchy, that some supporters of the monarchy continue to cite to the present day. So loyalty to the crown was important, but also it was emphasized as early as 1878 that Canadians were a democratic people. There would be no court dress. No one would be backing out of the room, that the young royal couple should be expected to meet people from all walks of life. And then the third theme that emerged was the importance of engaging with Canadian pastimes. And we now think of a vice-regal couple as being much older, but Lord Lorne and Princess Louise were 30 and 32. So they threw themselves into skating and tobogganing, and Lord Lorne became the patron of the Governor General's curling club, which meant he got to be the skip as well. And so we see there's a lot of approval when royalty throws themselves into Canadian pastimes and defines themselves as being Canadian. So I think there's a direct line between Princess Louise and Lord Lorne on the curling rink, all the way through to Prince William playing road hockey in 2011 in Yellowknife. So this is the framework for these royal tours. There was a strong emphasis on showcasing Canada. So 1951, Princess Elizabeth arrives with Prince Philip, and she arrives wearing the mink coat that had been a wedding gift from Canada, along with antique silver. And the Queen always had a talent for that. If she was in New Zealand, she was wearing a fern brooch. If she was in Canada, she was wearing a maple leaf brooch. So making very clear that she was happy to be there in Canada. Interestingly, on that particular tour, Prince Philip very much attracted the attention of the crowds, that women were shrieking and men were saying good old Phil, whereas Princess Elizabeth was seen as more reserved. And part of the reason for that may have been that her father, King George VI, had just had surgery for lung cancer. She was traveling with the documents of accession just in case there was a change in reign, as there would be in 1952. So Princess Elizabeth came across as more reserved and Prince Philip as more gregarious. And what's striking is we see a lot of praise of the Canadian armed forces, as this is just after the Second World War. We see a lot of praise of Canadian society and technology and technological innovations. Prince Philip in particular was always happy to be on a ship or be going down a mine or otherwise see how technologies worked. But there were also these informal moments, going to a hockey game, going to the Calgary Stampede with Prince Philip in a white hat, as Prince William would do in 2011, and Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip square dancing at Rideau Hall, and him in blue jeans and her in a big 1950 style skirt. And this became a popular Canadian Christmas card motif. So anytime there was a royal tour, often this became part of Canadian culture, the motifs, the activities that were being emphasized. And until 1959 and the 45-day cross-country royal tour, often royal tours were also an opportunity to showcase the Canadian Pacific Railway, as these cross-country tours by train were a way of showcasing Canadian technology and geography and landscape. So all of these tours, there's a fascination with the royal couple who is there, but there's also a bigger discussion about what side of itself is Canada sharing with the royal couple and with the wider world. What face is Canada presenting to the world? So these royal tours take on a more significance than you might expect as the decades pass, and the Queen became the best traveled monarch in Canadian history.
So, and of course, one of the things about these, of course, because unlike in England, where the royal family is constantly everywhere, they're opening galas, they're going here, they're going there, they're doing charitable work. These really are rare occasions for us, as you say, to come up close and personal with royalty, and also to present ourselves. But there's also sort of I think, a changing willingness among the Canadian people to just kind of go along with, I guess, the princess and royal and queenly, I don't want to call it a facade, but beneath the stops on the tour, there were real challenges and even in some cases resentments happening. And so one of the things that you mentioned, for instance, was in 1964, when the Queen visited Quebec City. Now, the Queen is fluently bilingual and came to Quebec City. I'm not sure what her expectations were, but what she ran into was something completely different. Can you just walk us very briefly through what happened in that 1964 event and sort of what it signaled in terms of the changing attitudes towards the monarchy in Canada?
Well, the Queen was there for the anniversary of the Quebec City Accords leading up to Confederation. And she gave a speech in French in the Quebec legislature where she stated she was happy there was somewhere in the Commonwealth that she could express herself in the French language. And she praised French-Canadian society. However, by that time, there was an evolution in attitudes towards the monarchy. Previously, supporters of the monarchy in Quebec, and of course there had always been a discussion and debate, had viewed those who supported the monarchy had viewed them as supporters of minority rights within a larger democracy. And there had been attempts to make royal tours of Quebec distinctly French-Canadian. And we see that in 1939, where La Presse was saying about George VI and Queen Elizabeth that we are here to cheer the crown and the royal couple, not British imperialism. If we cheer in French, we sing our songs, that this is our royal couple. So 1939, there were aspects of making this royal tour distinct to Quebec, and even emphasizing that in Montreal that more was being spent on the 1939 royal tour than in Toronto, that a greater welcome was being laid out, and there'd be fine French cuisine, unlike the hot dogs they would be having when they reached the United States. So we see in 1939 aspects of the tour being made to be distinctly Quebecois. But by 1964, it's very different. And this isn't so much directed at the monarch personally, but the monarchy had come to be associated not just with British imperialism, but with the rise of Quebec sovereignty. The monarchy was seen as a federal institution. And there are a number of speeches that the Queen made over the course of her reign in Canada, where she praised Canadian federalism, English and French and other cultures working together to create this great land. So those who opposed Quebec remaining part of Confederation, that the Queen was seen as supporting federalism. So there's a lot of complex historical and political currents there. The Queen was never in any danger, but there were protesters who the police overreacted to in some ways. This became known as Truncheon Sunday. And there were concerns for the rest of the Queen's reign whenever she returned to Quebec. Would there be trouble? And certainly the current King Charles III faced protesters in 2009 when he visited with the now Queen Camilla on their first Canadian tour as a married couple. But Queen Elizabeth II was well received when she rode the monorail at Expo 67 in 1967, and the Montreal Olympics in 1976. The provincial government in Quebec didn't want the Queen to be there, but she accepted the invitation from the federal government, and the public actually found that tour quite interesting because Princess Anne was competing in the equestrian event. So the Queen opened the Olympics, but it was very much the Queen, Prince Philip, and their three sons cheering Princess Anne as she competed in the equestrian event. So it helped to humanize the royal family, seeing them all together at this event in Canada. Another royal visitor who was well received in Quebec was Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who, as Colonel-in-Chief of the Black Watch Regiment in Montreal, made a number of visits there and was well received. So the monarchy as a whole has very little support in Quebec today, but individual royal tours have exceeded expectations. When William and Catherine toured in 2011, there were those who opposed the monarchy, but who thought this wasn't a time for protest, though there were some protests, as the world's press was there, and this could be a tourism Quebec video as they traveled from Montreal to Quebec City. So hosting this royal tour was a way of showcasing the province. So it's interesting that we see those who engage with royal tours. Often there's a variety of different motives, and the history of the monarchy in Quebec is quite complicated.
So the Bruce mentioned in his introduction that you know, the royal family itself, I mean, is sort of separate but connected with the Queen, because the Queen herself, I think, has a certain amount of respect and a sense of dignity and a sense of stoic duty that she exemplified throughout her life. But of course, and we'll just go briefly through this because we have so much to talk about as well with Chris and then with our discussion at the end. But we can't really discuss the Queen and her life without talking about the challenges that she faced in terms of like controlling the image of her own family and the possible damage that some of aspects of the scandals, about whether real or fueled by paparazzi, might have caused in terms of I guess the willingness of especially former colonies of Britain to want to continue with the monarchy. And so we look at everything from where, I still remember when Diana died. Again, that was a shocking moment. And that was before the internet. That was before Twitter. And when I found out about that, like people just couldn't believe it. The tears, the crying, Charles and Camilla, well, they've made a soap opera out of it, The Crown on Netflix. I just wonder what kind of impact in the face of the Queen's efforts to sorry, that's my daughter calling me. In the efforts of the Queen to I guess do her duty, how challenging was it for her to do that amidst this constant turmoil and chaos of the last few decades?
Well, with the monarchy, the personal and the political always intersect, and the Queen's grandchildren have spoken with great admiration of how she stepped into this role in 1952 at the age of 25, when there were not many young women in senior political roles. Prince Philip stepped back from his role in the Royal Navy in order to be a supportive consort, so he was ahead of his time as well. And so we see a lot of 1950s coverage of the Queen being in the context of the expectations of women at that time as well. There were moments on royal tours and royal walkabouts where the Queen might be asked who was with the children, and the Queen would good-naturedly say, "Oh, they're with their grandmother," who's spoiling them. And so they are very well. And then as the royal children grew older, there was the question of to what degree the personal lives of the royal family would be in the public eye. One of the reasons the future Charles III was sent off to boarding school in Scotland, which he did not enjoy at Gordonston, is Prince Philip thought that would keep him away from the press. He'd have more privacy up there than if he was closer to London, attending Eton, like as William and Harry would do so. So there's a lot of press interest in the royal children as they grew older. And then in 1969, there was a behind the scenes royal family documentary. And for many people, it was the first time they'd seen film footage of Prince Philip manning the barbecue at Balmoral, or the Queen and her children having a natural conversation with one another. The coverage of the Montreal Olympics was also fascinating, and seeing members of the royal family just chatting with one another. The Queen, in many ways, receives less press coverage in the 1980s, when the marriages of her children attracted more and more of the attention of the public, and the next generation of the royal family attracted a great deal of attention. And then in the 1990s, we have 1992, the Queen's Annus Horribilis, which is currently being very heavily fictionalized in The Crown on Netflix, with the breakdown of 3 of the Queen's 4 children's marriages. And then there was once again scrutiny of the royal family. Should the Queen have tried to manage her children more closely? Unlike Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth II tended to give her children and her grandchildren a great deal of autonomy to make their own decisions. And Prince William has commented on how much he appreciated that, the freedom to be able to pursue his own interests and become a search and rescue pilot. So there was some scrutiny of the Queen as matriarch of her family. But these royal scandals also intersected with wider debates at a time when there were more people who were in divorced families, for instance. Perhaps the royal family was reflecting the changing times And so we see whenever there is a royal scandal, often there's a bigger debate that unfolds. What does this say about women, about the family, about the personal and the political? So often royal events, even rather unsavory royal events, serve as a touchstone for bigger debates about what society looks like, how social norms are evolving over time. So royal news tends to take on a life of its own, and Queen Elizabeth II had the talent to many ways remain above some of this critical scrutiny that was directed at some of the members of her family.
So I think this is a good point. We have so much more to talk about, but I'd like to bring Christopher Moore in. And Chris's article in the latest issue takes a look at, I guess, how the crown itself is so interwoven in the fabric of Canada itself, and also examines a little bit, I guess, some of the potential futures that Canada might seek in terms of remaining with the monarchy or becoming a republic or something else, if it has the desire to do so. And so, Chris, I'm going to start off with the same question that I started with Carolyn to begin, and then we'll get into a little bit more about your article. But what went through your mind when you heard about the Queen's passing? Well, you're muted, Chris. I'll have to get you to unmute yourself. Chris, you'll have to unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted now, I think.
There you go. Perfect.
After the initial surprise of the news and some reflection about the passing of one of the great personalities of the 20th and 21st century, I actually found myself thinking about my own mother. My mother was British. She was almost the same age as Queen Elizabeth. My mother's been dead for 20 years, but they were contemporaries. They were teenagers at the same time, I guess. They went through the hardships of the Second World War. I think my mother always felt some identity with the Queen Elizabeth, a sort of a parallel life, though obviously Queen Elizabeth never knew she existed. And so my thoughts went back to her and how she would have felt about that. But for myself, I'm a Canadian. I don't think I ever thought of Queen Elizabeth as being anything else but British and the royal family. So I took an interest in it. I certainly enjoy The Crown. It's a wonderful drama, but I've been a Canadian all my life, and I think I do think of the monarchy as being the British monarchy. And I must admit, I like our Governor Generals. I like the idea that we have a Canadian head of state as well.
Well, I think in a nutshell, you've just summed up, I guess, a lot of the modern sentiment about the crown, because I know that there was it was described in the magazine articles about how there was a conscious decision years ago by legislators to have the Queen be declared the Queen of Canada rather than the Lord of her dominions over the seas, as if we were just an afterthought. We're just something else, some other place that Britain conquered. And of course, there was that sort of like, it's almost like a branding exercise. Can we brand the Queen and the British royal family as the royal family of Canada? And for a lot of people, still, it worked. And they do see that monarchy as a Canadian monarchy. But I think going to the heart of your article, I think there's a bit of misconceptions out there, and maybe not a complete understanding in society in general, in terms of what the actual crown, separating the crown from the Queen, and what does the crown actually mean? How is it woven into the fabric of Canada? I'm just wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit for those who haven't had a chance to see your article. But why is the crown so intrinsic to everything from laws to treaties to governments to our society in general, as currently constituted?
Sure, Mark. We are a constitutional monarchy, always have been. And therefore, the crown is a synonym for the state, for Canada. So when we talk about whether it's private property or it's crown land out there, I don't think our mind flashes to Queen Elizabeth or to King Charles. We're aware that we're talking about the state owns that land. The same thing with crown corporations, with a whole range of crown things. When my daughter is actually a prosecutor in the courts in Toronto, and when the judge says, "What is the Crown's view on that?" I don't think she thinks about what King Charles would want or what Queen Elizabeth would have wanted. She is the Crown at that moment, and she puts forward the prosecution case. So we certainly have the Crown as that symbol of the state. That it's a shorthand to refer to the state, whether it's the province of Ontario or the province of British Columbia or the government of Canada. We use it for that. But at the same time, you know, even before the death of Queen Elizabeth, polls had pretty consistently been showing that, you know, towards 70% of the Canadian people will say they don't really feel much connection to the monarchy. They feel like Canadians. And, you know, we are a sovereign nation and we are a democratic people. And I think if that's such a substantial number of the people of Canada feel that they don't feel much connection with the person who is, at least in theory, the head of state of Canada as our king, I think we're going to have to face up to that and discuss that eventually. It's something.
Sorry, I was just thinking, one of the things that you say in your article that was so fascinating is the idea of Canada having this discussion, but also there needs to be a process. If we ever did want to become a republic, there's a complicated process that would need to happen to have to happen legally. Can you explain a little bit about the idea of you had mentioned about how the unanimity of all the provinces and the territories and what exactly it would mean or require for us if we did want to start going down that republic road?
We have a constitution. We have a written constitution, and I'm glad we do. And I think we benefit from it in many ways. But it means that when you have a written constitution, you've got to obey the rules. And the different countries in the Commonwealth all do this a bit differently. In Barbados, not long ago, essentially a resolution of Parliament decreed that there no longer would be the monarchy in Barbados, and they made that happen. There was some, obviously it didn't happen overnight, they prepared for it, but essentially the Parliament is sovereign and it made that decision. In Australia, it's in their constitution that any major changes to the constitution, they have to have a referendum. A national referendum will decide things. In Canada, we don't have anything in the constitution about referenda. And it does say that on any change to the office of the Queen, as they say, would require the unanimous consent of the federal government and each of the provinces. Now, I think today, in our circumstances, we would need buy-in from the First Nations in some sense as well. So that does make a complicated process because, as you know, since 1982, since the Constitution was patriated and can be amended in Canada, it never has been on any substantial matter. And you can imagine some of the premiers say, well, there's more important things to talk about. Some might say, well, I'll give you this if you give me more fishing rights or a new pipeline, or, one doesn't know what kind of bargaining might go on. Again, I think if that consensus that seems to have been forming in Canada really over decades, that the British monarchy is pretty remote from our concerns here in Canada, eventually that's going to come out. But that step towards making a constitutional change, a formal constitutional change, it's not something we do very often, and it doesn't happen with the snap of a finger.
And I know even in my reading of opinion columns and like everybody else, I try to keep abreast of different sentiment. And I know that if a staunch monarchist was here, and there may be among our group tonight, they would probably argue that the Crown fulfills its role perfectly because, and that by being in Britain and not based here, it actually is arm's length enough that it can remain out of the fray. And of course, the Governor Generals and Lieutenant Governors, represent the Crown on Canadian soil, except when the monarch arrives. But they would argue that even just trying to pick who would be, say, the new president of the Canadian Republic could turn into this never-ending battle and argument over who would represent who. And of course, but then on the other hand, as you point out with the Indigenous peoples who weren't asked anything when Canada was created. It was imposed upon them. There's also very mixed feelings about their relationship with the Crown. For instance, here in Winnipeg, we saw recently Queen Victoria's statue and the statue of Queen Elizabeth were torn down at the legislature during a protest in the wake of the discoveries of the unmarked graves at some of the residential schools. A lot of anger boils over. But on the other hand, in Alberta, just right now, in the face of the Sovereignty Act, there's Indigenous nations that are fighting to keep the relationship with the Crown and Indigenous people, seeing that if you take that away from us, you're basically kneecapping our treaty relationship. It's very complicated. So I guess when we look at that, and I might bring Carolyn into this discussion as well. I'm cognizant of the time. Is there a possibility that we could ever see a republic in Canada, or is it just the challenge so insurmountable? And maybe there's an argument to be said that we have the best of both worlds now. I'm not sure. I'll open it with you first, Chris, and then we'll go to Carolyn.
Yeah. I think in a way I don't want to minimize your descriptions of the complications, which I actually laid out in some detail, as you know, in the article. But I think we wouldn't get buy-in from the First Nations of Canada on really anything to do with the Constitution until there's movement on their issues, until they think we're starting to take reconciliation a lot more seriously. And I think that would be a good thing too. I think we do need to start moving on that. I think if the two processes started working together, can you imagine how wonderful it would be to inaugurate a Governor General as our head of state, using Native regalia and Native symbolism and Native music and dancing? It would be a tremendously Canadian system that some pale imitation of a British coronation just wouldn't be nearly the same for most of us. And I think it's the same almost with our political system, because if a lot of Canadians are feeling we need to do something about this, then we do need to address the Constitution and also how we would choose our leaders. And at the moment, we're so dependent. We seem to let premiers and prime ministers do everything, and the MPs and MLAs and MPPs we elect hardly get to do anything. I think we're going to need to engage a lot of our representatives in the process of how we actually went on choosing governor generals in future, and not just let the prime minister hire them when there's a vacancy. So I'm actually hopeful that we should think about a Canadian head of state as part of movement towards reconciliation, and maybe even improving our political system, our political operations a little better. I think there's a chance to build that kind of diverse, tolerant, equal Canadian society where any child can dream of growing up to be our head of state, our governor general. I think we can be optimistic about that, even though the challenges are immense. We can do this.
And Carolyn, I'll ask you the same question, and then we're going to wrap up with one more final question. Then we will open it up to questions for people. I want to make sure we have lots of time for a discussion. But I wonder, Carolyn, because you spend so much of your professional career as a historian studying the monarchy, talking about the monarchy. I'm wondering how you picture this whole debate and discussion about the republicanism versus remaining a constitutional monarchy.
Well, like many historians, I tend to take the long view, and the monarchy has proven itself to have a tremendous capacity for reinvention. There have been many moments where things were not going well for the monarchy's reputation. There was rising Republican sentiment. We see that Queen Victoria's reign when she was first widowed, that in the United Kingdom, though not in Canada, because we weren't used to seeing Queen Victoria in person, but in the United Kingdom, there was declining support for the monarchy, as the Queen was not seen as undertaking her constitutional duties. She was only opening Parliament when there was an annuity or a dowry for one of her children that was being debated at that time. So support for the monarchy dips. And then with Queen Victoria becoming increasingly associated with empire and imperialism, we see with the Jubilees there being a rising support in some circles as she comes to be associated with what Britain perceived as its accomplishments at that time. So it's very striking that every time it seems like things are on a downward slope, that the monarchy manages to pull itself out of that. In Queen Elizabeth II's reign, going from the Annus Horribilis in 1992 to Queen Elizabeth II being this respected elder stateswoman at the time of the Golden Jubilee, the Diamond Jubilee, the Platinum Jubilee. So support for the monarchy tends to go in phases. I think in Canada, it would be very difficult to get all 10 provinces on the same page at this time. I can't predict what will happen over the course of the 21st century, but I think there's clear evidence that it would be very difficult to achieve at this time, because when the federal government wanted a day of commemoration for Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, the provinces reacted in strikingly different ways. Quebec was not acknowledging this at all. Meanwhile, some of the maritime provinces were shutting down their transit systems and treating this as a full day of mourning. And in Ontario, there was well, we're not giving everyone a day off, but there will be a moment of silence to acknowledge the Queen, and the TTC will stop running for a few minutes. And so it was interesting that every province and territory seemed to react differently to the Queen's passing. And I thought that if all 10 provinces can't come to an agreement on whether there should be a day of mourning for Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, it would be very difficult for all 10 provinces to agree on constitutional change. And it's unlikely that any politician is going to stake their career on this, as it's an issue that can go in unexpected directions. In Australia in 1999, it looked like they were headed towards a republic, but there ended up being a debate as to what the new system of government would look like. Would the president be chosen by the politicians or by the people? And so Queen Elizabeth II, as the familiar, known, respected quantity, squeaked through in the referendum, though she avoided being in Australia at the time and campaigning in any way. So those politicians who very strongly backed that referendum found it didn't go in the direction that they expected. So there may be Canadian politicians who, even if they support a republic, might think that they don't want their name being attached to a system and a process that may not go as planned. So I think we will see out the reigns of Charles III and likely William V as well. I won't predict beyond that.
So I'm noticing the time. We have about 12 minutes left. And usually during these events, I talk so much that I basically don't leave time for questions. And so I'm going to do two things. I'm inviting everybody to ask questions. You can either unmute yourself and ask a question directly, or if you're really savvy with Zoom, there's a way to type in the chat at the bottom of the screen if you have a question. And I'm going to kick us off because I'm being greedy. I have one more question, but I'll ask you both to keep it fairly succinct so we leave time for the crowd's, the guests' questions. But it's this: it's back to Queen Elizabeth. What do you think will be her lasting legacy in the minds of Canadians? And I'll ask Carolyn first, and we'll try to keep it brief, and then we'll move to Chris, and then we'll move to the floor for questions.
I think it will be her role as head of the Commonwealth, that she was there for that transition from empire and dominions to Commonwealth of equal nations, and she was able to exercise subtle diplomatic influence in that role. Former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, in an interview with the Toronto Star, indicated that the Queen was subtly in favor of sanctions on apartheid South Africa, which was not British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's view, but this was a case where the Queen could accept the advice of her Commonwealth prime ministers and made efforts to keep the Commonwealth together. And now we see countries that were never part of the British Empire applying to join the Commonwealth. Mozambique, for instance, which was part of the Portuguese Empire, because the surrounding African nations belong to the Commonwealth. So Mozambique wants to be there at those diplomatic summits. So So I think the Queen's diplomatic role, and the more time that passes, the more documents that will be available to study. I think there will be a lasting legacy there of the Queen having a role on the world stage. And there have been some very good books about that by Robert Hardman and Philip Murphy about the monarchy and the end of empire, or the Queen of the world. So I think the Queen's global role is going to be what she's remembered for.
Okay, thank you. And Chris?
I think it might be less than that. I follow that substantial majority that the polls have been showing for quite a while, that most Canadians feel really not that connected to the British monarchy anymore. It's a British thing. She's a great figure in the same way that, you know, Henry VIII and Queen Victoria and many British monarchs are world historical figures who will remain of interest to people forever. I don't doubt that a moment, but a legacy to Canada, you know, I think the legacy has been shifting in the other direction. Certainly when she came to the throne, I think the assumption that she was our queen and we were part of Britain's empire was very strong, and that's just slid away, despite the Queen Elizabeth's many qualities and many charms. We are very different countries. We live in different worlds, and we don't have an aristocracy in Canada. We don't have hereditary honors. We don't have a hereditary upper house. Many of the things that are part and parcel of being British just don't kind of register here as much. So I'm not sure there's a profound legacy in Canada for the Queen, except that story, that the romance of monarchy that survives for many people. Perhaps what we need is for the next World Cup to have Canada and England play the finals and see who the royal family roots for. And maybe that's way that'll be the test for Canadian or if the English team could ever get to the World Championships of hockey. But
I believe
anyway,
I believe that Prince William roots for England in soccer, but Wales in rugby.
Okay, there you go. There you go. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having both of you. And so I'm going to open it up to our guests. If anybody has any questions, I invite anybody. If you know how Zoom works, just unmute yourself. You can also put a question in the chat if you like, and I'll just give you guys maybe a 10 seconds. Oh, here we are. From Cheryl. I am not as convinced by polls as it seems highly contingent on the questions that are asked, but I don't think that we seek buy-in from Indigenous people, but rather they're equal partners on the relationship with the Crown. At a pragmatic level, you rarely hear what it would be replaced with. So if either of you want to kind of jump in with, I guess, touching on that, we touched on it briefly, but that idea of what in the world, who gets to decide what it will be if it's not the Crown, and what does that look like, I guess? Cheryl's absolutely right about any individual poll. Polls are for dogs, as a famous prime minister once said. But if you look at the opinions that have been measured really over decades, there's a consensus there. And it's true that answers differ on particular questions, and depending on how the question is phrased, the results are different. But I think there is that broad consensus. And what we'd replace it with, well, as I said, we're a sovereign nation. These are adult choices we should be able to make. I would be very much content with a continuation of the Governor General. We've had Governor Generals in Canada back to not quite to Samuel de Champlain, but every head of government in Canada since then has answered to a Governor General. And I think we could work out a process to engage Canadians and our governments and the Indigenous nations in a dignified and democratic process of choosing the Governor General. I'm sure that when you had the Governor General's History Awards in Quebec City the other day, I'm sure those teachers and writers that you honored were just thrilled to meet our terrific Governor General. And I've actually met a couple of Governor Generals. I've certainly never met a member of the royal family, and I don't think we expect to get King Charles or to have Queen Elizabeth come every year to Canada to perform that ceremonial. It's something we deserve, to have a full-time head of state who is here, who is one of us, and
I guess eventually we're going to face up to the complications.
I
Okay.
think the question of the, oh,
Go ahead, Carolyn.
sorry, I think the question of the polling data is also very strongly shaped by the state of civics education more widely in Canada. Unfortunately, through popular culture, a lot of Americanisms work their way in. So some Canadians have a view of our system as being closer to that of the United States, when in fact, we have this Westminster system of government. So some of the polls, as Cheryl points out, can be very variable. And one of my favorites is from the Golden Jubilee of 2002, in which more than half of Canadians said that the monarchy is a part of Canadian culture that differentiates us from Americans. And that's a view that's existed all the way back to the 19th century. But when asked to name who is our head of state, only 5% stated that it was Queen Elizabeth II. So many people thought it was the Governor General or it was the Prime Minister. So I think for there to be a debate over the future of the monarchy, what should come next, I think there needs to be more attention paid to understanding the system that we have so that it can be debated in all of its nuances so that there aren't unforeseen consequences to the changes.
And, thank you very much, guys. And we have a comment from Bruce who says Constitution writing by polling seems risky. Bruce, what do you mean? Isn't that how we always do things? We just run a poll and no, I'm very cognizant of the time. I know we could talk about this all night long, and I invite everybody, if you hadn't had a chance to read the articles in plug time in Canada's History magazine, the preeminent magazine, makes a great stocking stuffer, believe me. But there's more details in there about that story, and also some stories about the Halifax explosion and a residential school hockey team, lots of information in there. And I appreciate not only our two historians joining us tonight, but also all of our supporters joining us as well. You've heard a little bit about the Governor General's Award and some of the conversations we're having, but I think that before I throw it over to our President and CEO, Bob Cox, I just wanted to touch on Carolyn's comment, which is, of course, that idea of educating people. It's very crucial. And if people aren't, I see ourselves, we're in the context business here. Our job is to help people understand the past so they can make educated decisions about the future and better understand their lives today. And that's bang on, in my opinion, in terms of any type of conversations we need in the future. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to President and CEO Bob Cox for a few final thoughts. And then, and otherwise, thanks so much again for joining us. Over to you, Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Mark, for so ably moderating the discussion tonight. Some very interesting points were made. And thank you to Christopher and to Carolyn for joining us and for providing your very, very informed insights. It was great. One thing I can guarantee is this will not be the last discussion of the monarchy in Canada. I don't know whether we'll get to William, was it William V, Carolyn, you said, or
yes,
whatever?
William V.
I'm pretty sure I probably won't get there to have the debate while William V is king. But however, I can tell you the debate won't end. And the reason I know this is because I had a debate about the monarchy at the gym this morning, and I didn't even start it. So it is being discussed in all parts of Canada, I think, and by some people. It all started because of the discussion of the toonie. The Mint has come out with a new coin now that has a black band around it. The toonie will have a black band around it to mark the Queen's passing. And that led to more discussion about, well, who's going to be on our currency? Like, are we going to have Charles on our currency? And then somebody pulled out a $20 bill and said, well, I kind of like the Queen. I like Elizabeth on the $20 bill, and I think we should keep her on the $20 bill. So the consensus eventually was, and I did my own polling in the gym on this issue, by the way, the consensus was that they should, in fact, leave Elizabeth on the $20 bill because there's lots of dead people on our money, and we should just leave her on our money as a historical figure because she was so important to Canada. So that's the view from the gym on Wall Street in Winnipeg. And I think it reflects that a lot of Canadians are talking about this. So thanks very much. And I do want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. Among you are many of our very strong supporters, and we can't put on these events without you. We can't put on the events without your support, without the very generous donations that are made to keep Canada's History Society going and doing events like this, doing the work we do with Canada's History magazine, Kayak, and all the other various programs. So thank you very much for your support, and thanks for taking the time to join us tonight. It's great to have an opportunity to have access to people like Christopher and Carolyn to hear directly from them. And I think that we're going to end exactly on time at 6 o'clock, which is probably I don't know whether that's a precedent or not, because I'm new. I can't tell you whether it's a precedent, but I can tell you it's great to keep on schedule. So again, thanks very much, and I hope everybody has a great holiday season, and good night.